Hi students, let's get ready to talk about Escape from Warsaw. Today I'm going to read you chapter 4, but before we do that, let's do a little bit of a review. Let's think about chapters 1, 2, and 3 before we read chapter 4. All right, so let's think about what happened in chapter 1. If we were going to summarize it with one sentence, what do you think we would say in chapter 1? Could we say something like this? Joseph was arrested and put into a Nazi prison camp from which he later escaped. Is that really the main idea of what happened in chapter 1? It is. All right, so let's see if we can come up with one sentence that tells what happened in chapter 2. Take a moment and think about if you were just going to say one sentence about what happened in chapter 2, what happened to Joseph in chapter 2, what would you say? Could you say something like this? Trying to avoid capture, Joseph hid on a luggage lift which took him across a valley and away from the prison camp of Zakina. That's a pretty good summary of chapter 2. So let's think about how we would summarize chapter 3. Take a few seconds and think about one sentence that would tell what happened in chapter 3. Could we say something like this? Joseph stays with an old Polish couple who hide him from the Nazis. After staying a few weeks with them, he sets off to find his family. Now that, I used two sentences, but it pretty much summarizes what chapter 3 was about. All right, let's go on. Let's think about the titles of the chapters. Now, I've already asked you about this before, so let's think about chapter 1. The title of chapter 1 was The Escape. Do you remember why it was called that? It was called The Escape because Joseph escaped from the Zakina prison camp in that chapter. Chapter 2, you'll remember, was called Journey Through the Air. Why was that chapter called that? It was called that because Joseph took a journey through the air. He escaped across the steep mountain valley on the luggage lift. Now, if you've ever seen a ski lift or a picture of a ski lift, or maybe you've gone to the state fair or you've gone to Disney World and you've ridden on one of those sky rides, this is what he was on. There's a cable stretched from one mountain to the other, and when it went across the valley, that luggage lift was hanging in the air. It traveled across that valley on a cable. Okay, so when that chapter is called Journey Through the Air, it's called that because when he was in the middle of the valley, there wasn't anything under the luggage lift. It was just air. Okay, so let's think about chapter 3. Chapter 3 was called The Hiding Place. Why do we think chapter 3 was called that? Yeah, it was called that because Joseph had to hide from the Nazis. He was with the old couple. The Nazis came looking for the escaped prisoner. Remember, the little old man hadn't had time to give the warning signal. And the little old lady told Joseph he could hide where? That's right, she told him that he could hide up in the chimney. And so he climbed up in the chimney to avoid being detected by the Nazi soldiers. They almost would have detected him, except for soot fell out of the chimney, and they didn't want to get their uniforms dirty, so they left. So chapter 3 the hiding place. Joseph hid out from the Nazis for a few weeks with an old Polish couple. He actually had two hiding places. Okay, um, he hid up in the chimney, but he hid with them. He stayed there in the house with them for those 2 or 3 weeks while they fed him, they let him rest. He recovered from being in the prison camp. So he hid in the moment of the Nazis being there. He hid in the chimney, but he hid out with them for the few weeks because remember it said in the chapter that he didn't even go outside because he didn't want anybody to see him. So he hid out there and he got strong for what's going to come next in chapter 4. So chapter 4 is called The Silver Sword. Okay, I want you to take a few seconds. I want you to make a prediction about why this chapter has this particular title, The Silver Sword. Now I want you to think back before we started reading this book, and I told you that the original title for Escape from Warsaw was The Silver Sword. Now if you get this book from Audible, you'd have to look for it under the title The Silver Sword. If you're in another country, you would find this book under the title The Silver Sword. Why is this chapter, do you think, called The Silver Sword? Take a couple of seconds and think about it. All right, let's think about conflict. We know in chapter 1 there was a man versus nature conflict because remember Joseph, part of his plan was to get sent to the cooler. He had to wait till springtime, but it said in the chapter that he had to not fall asleep or he might freeze to death in there. So that's a man versus nature. He has to be careful of the temperature in that prison cell or he might freeze to death. Okay, in chapter 2, let's talk about a man versus self conflict. Of course, you realize that if I say man versus self or man versus nature, that is the same thing as saying character versus nature or character versus self. It's also the same thing as if I said person versus nature or person versus self. In this particular case, I used man because it was shorter and it fit in my text boxes. But man is not talking about men and boys. Man is talking about in the broader sense of mankind, which includes male and females. Okay? So in chapter 2, we have a man versus self conflict. When Joseph walked out of the prison camp, his number one fear was being caught. And so he encountered some soldiers on the road and he jumped behind some crates to hide from them. And it just turned out he was on the luggage lift. Okay? Now, the luggage lift, remember, started to move out across the valley and it got a little ways and Joseph's thinking, woohoo, I am home free. I'm going to be away from here. But then the luggage lift reversed direction and it came back to its starting point. And he was thinking, for sure, I'm going to get captured. And I think even some soldiers might have come on the luggage lift, maybe to bring another crate on board. And he knew for sure that he was going to get captured. And remember, he reached into the holster he was wearing, because remember, he took the prison guard's uniform. But when he reached in the holster, he was expecting to find a gun so he can protect himself, but he didn't find a gun there. What did he find? That's right, he found a bar of chocolate. Okay? But the conflict he felt within himself was fear. And he felt so much fear that he was willing to take that gun that he thought he was wearing and use it to protect himself. Okay? So let's think about the conflict in chapter 3. In chapter 3, there's a man versus a society conflict, character versus society. Um, and at this point, remember, the Nazis had invaded Poland. And so Poland wasn't running by Polish rules, it's running by the rules of the Nazis at this point. And because Joseph had been put into the prison for turning Hitler's picture over, remember, Hitler was the leader of the Nazis and the leader of Germany. Because he had been put into prison for that, that is a type of man versus society conflict that was in chapter 1. Um, he had to work to get out of the prison camp, to escape the prison camp. He had to do it in a disguise. He couldn't even get near the prison camp fence in chapter 2, where it said he'd be caught because he was a prisoner. So that's a type of man versus society conflict in chapter 2. In chapter 3, his man versus society conflict is the soldiers coming to look for him. And if they'd have found him, they would have killed him, or they would have taken him back to the prison camp of Sakina and thrown him into the cooler. They could have done all kinds of things to him, but he would have been under arrest at the very minimum. All right, so in chapter 4, I want you to listen for and look for a man versus man type of conflict. This is a character versus character conflict. All right? That's what we're going to be listening for in chapter 4. All right, let's think about the main characters. In chapter 1, which character had the most action? Yes, it was Joseph. In chapter 2, which character had the most action? Were there any other characters in chapter 1? Who had the most action? I'm sorry, in chapter 2. In chapter 2, the main character is Joseph. In chapter 3, we actually have 3 characters in chapter 3. There are 3 characters that speak in that chapter. There's Joseph, but then there's 2 more. There's the little old man and the little old woman. But out of those 3 characters, who is the primary character? That's right, it was Joseph. Okay, so that's important that Joseph is the main character in the first 3 chapters. Now, let's make a guess. Who do we think is going to be the main character of chapter 4? All right, I have done something here. I made a copy. I took pictures of the book pages so that you could read along with me. I'm still going to read it out loud, but I'm probably doing something bad by doing this, but don't take these pages and sell them, okay? All right, chapter 4, The Silver Sword. It took Joseph 4.5 weeks to walk to Warsaw. He had lived in the city all of his life and knew it well, but now on his return there was hardly a street he recognized and not an undamaged building anywhere. The place was as bleak and silent as the craters of the moon. Instead of proud homes, he found crumbling walls. Instead of streets, tracks of rubble between mountains of bricks. Windows were charred and glassless. Public buildings were burned out shells. In the wilderness, people still managed to go on living. Joseph saw them wandering pale and hungry-eyed and vanish down paths of their own into the ruins. They had made their homes in cellars or had dug caves in the rubble. A few had even tried to make them look gay. That means festive, happy, homey. A bomb gash in a cellar wall was draped with bright curtains. In another hole there was a window box full of purple crocuses. Here and there a tree that had escaped blast damage sprouted with spring leaves. But the only really lively place was the railway. The Nazis had to keep this clear, whatever the cost. Never had Joseph seen railway lines gleam as these did. 8 lines of polished steel, along which day and night the busy trains poured. Eastward, with carriages of troops and trucks of ammunition, they carried war to Russia. Westward, they brought back the wounded to Germany, and sometimes rich plunder from the Ukraine. Joseph spent 3 days finding the street where he used to live. The school and schoolhouse, his home, had disappeared. There was a house opposite with a sign marked Polish Welfare. He made some inquiries there, but the people were new and could not help him. At another house, he had better luck. He knew the woman who lived there, a Mrs. Krause, who had had a child at his school some years ago. In a small back room, he questioned her eagerly about his family. "The Nazis destroyed your school," she said. "What happened to my wife?" "They came for her in January last year, during the night. It was just after Dr. Frank called for 1 million foreign workers to go to Germany. She's in Germany, probably working on the land. I'm a member of the Polish Council for Protection, and we tried to trace her, but without success." "And the children? Did they go with her?" asked Joseph. Mrs. Krause turned away. "I don't know anything about them," she said. Joseph felt that she was hiding unpleasant news. He begged her to speak. I know nothing," she said. "That's not true," he said. "As a member of the council, you must have found out something." At last, with a weary sigh, she told him all she knew. "On the night your wife was taken away, someone fired at the van from the attic of your house. A tire was punctured, and one of the Nazi soldiers was hit in the arm. But they got away with the van all the same. An hour later, they sent a truckload of soldiers with explosives. They blew the whole place up. The children have not been seen since." Joseph was too dazed to grasp all this at once, and Mrs. Krause had to repeat it. She told him of the efforts made to trace them, but it was obvious that she believed them to be dead. Without a word, Joseph got up and went out into the street. For the rest of the day, he wandered among the ruins, too dazed to think. He spent the night in the burned-out shell of a bus station. In spite of the rain which fell through the roof, he slept. He spent the next few days searching among the ruins for his children, with a kind of hopeless despair. At night he returned to the home of the Krauses, who fed him and gave him a bed. One night Mrs. Krause said to him, "It's no use your going on like this. Your children are not alive. The house was locked before the soldiers left, and they must have died in the explosion. If you want to go on searching, search for your wife." "Germany's a large place," said Joseph. "What hope should I have of finding her?" "She might escape as you did," said Mrs. Krause. "You have known that something like this might have happened. Did you ever make any plans? Did you never fix a meeting place?" Joseph thought for a moment. "Yes, as a matter of fact, we did. We arranged that if we were separated, we would try to make for Switzerland. My wife is Swiss, and her parents live there still." Mrs. Krause took her hands, pardon me, Mrs. Krause took his hands in hers and smiled. "There's your answer, then. Go to Switzerland, and with God's help, you will find her there." "But the children, they may still be here," said Joseph. He spent several more days looking for them. One afternoon, while he was poking among the rubble of his old home, he found a tiny silver sword. About 5 inches long, it had a brass hilt engraved with a dragon breathing fire. It was a paper knife that he had once given to his wife for a birthday present. It's a letter opener, kids. While he was cleaning the blade on his jersey, he noticed that he was not alone. A small, ragged boy sat watching him keenly. He had fair, wispy hair and unnaturally bright eyes. Under one arm he had a wooden box, under the other a bony gray kitten. For a moment Joseph thought it was his son, Edic. Then he realized that he was too small for Edic. He walked over and stroked the kitten. "What's his name?" he asked. "He hasn't got a name. He's just mine," said the boy. "What's your name?" said Joseph. The boy pouted and hugged the wooden box under his arm. His eyes were shrewdly summing Joseph up. After a while, "Give me that sword," he said. "But it's mine," said Joseph. "You found it on my pitch. This is my place." Joseph explained about his house and how this rubble was all that was left of it. "I'll give you food for it," said the boy, and he offered Joseph a cheese sandwich. "I have plenty," said Joseph. He put his hand in his pocket, but it was empty. He looked again at the boy's sandwich and saw it was one that Mrs. Krause had given him that morning, only rather grubby now. "You little pickpocket!" he laughed. But before he could grab it back, the boy had swallowed most of it himself and had given the rest to the cat, which was now purring contentedly. After a while, Joseph said, "I'm looking for my family. Ruth is the oldest. She'd be 15 now, and tall and fair. Then Edic, he'd be 13. Branya is the youngest. She'd be 5. He described them briefly, told him what he knew of their fate, and asked if the boy had seen them. The boy shrugged his shoulders. "Warsaw's full of a lot of lost children," he said. "They're dirty and starving, and they all look alike." His words made him sound indifferent, but Joseph noticed that the boy had listened carefully and seemed to be storing everything in the back of his mind. "I'll give you this sword on one condition," said Joseph. "I'm not sure that my children are dead. If you ever see Ruth or Edic or Branya, you must tell them about our meeting. Tell them I'm going to Switzerland to find their mother, to their grandparents' home. Tell them to follow as soon as they can." The boy grabbed the sword before Joseph had time to change his mind. He popped it into the little wooden box, picked up the cat, and ran off. "I'll tell you more about them tomorrow," Joseph called after him. "Meet you here in the morning, and don't let me down." The boy vanished. All right, that's the end of chapter 4. Hope y'all enjoyed that.